profit from them. We cannot say we are protecting our children until we face this fact and pass legislation to stop it. In the spring of 2021, myself and several families were invited to meet with executives from Snapchat. Today, that meeting is what drives my fuel for social media reform. Snapchat's executives claimed that they had no idea this was happening, even though Snapchat and other platforms have been used for drug sales for years, and this has been widely reported by the media. They blamed us as parents and told us that due to Section 230, we had no power to hold them accountable in court. Senators, if someone opened a brick and mortar store and sold these drugs to our children out of that store, we would be held accountable. We would be shut down so fast. So I ask, why do the same rules not apply to social media? Since losing Devin, my family has watched drug dealers continue operating on Snapchat, Instagram, Telegram, and while we got zero justice for Devin's death, I'm proud to say we aided in the indictments of individuals with ties to the Sinaloa cartel in Minneapolis. I believe there were 19 members of that indictment. I'm grateful to the Hastings Police Department, Dakota County Drug Task Force, and U.S. Attorney Andrew Luger's work on this case. In speaking about Devin's story with middle and high school students, kids have shared the toll Snapchat takes on their mental health and how on average they are spending 26 plus hours a week on these platforms. That's why my family and so many others fight hard to support the Kids Online Safety Act. I thank Senators Blumenthal and Blackburn for spearheading this vital legislation on behalf of our children, because COSA is the crucial foundation for social media reform. I am blessed to work with my congressional representatives, Senator Amy Klobuchar and Representative Angie Craig. I want to thank Congresswoman Craig for introducing the Cooper Davis and Devin Noring Act, and Senator Klobuchar for acting on her commitment and promise to help parents achieve accountability for big tech. Parents like me, Mr. Puerta, Amy Neville, Andrea Thomas, Steve Filson, and thousands of others cannot do this alone. We look to you to pass COSA and the Cooper Davis and Devin Noring Act. We need you to stand with us and enact these pieces of legislation so that our country's kids have a fighting chance and stop losing their lives. I thank you. I'm honored to be here and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Noring. Dr. Westlake.
Chairman Corman, Ranking Member Durbin, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify and for your leadership. Before I talk science, I wanted to tell you the last time I used Narcan, it was just days ago. It was a quiet night shift in the emergency department, and I was mulling over my testimony for this very hearing when I had to rush out to a car that screeched into the ambulance bay. It was driven by the girlfriend of a patient who took what he thought was a Percocet. It was actually a lethal dose of fentanyl. He wasn't breathing and was about to go into cardiac arrest. We pulled him out and quickly resuscitated him with Narcan. Within a minute, he went from being blue and pulseless to being wide awake. He went home with his family that night. He was lucky this time. This is my reality and that of so many emergency physicians across America. We have a problem in this country, and it requires all of us to work together to solve it. First, I'd like to clarify what fentanyl-related substances, or FRSs, are and why permanently scheduling them as a class is a critical policy tool. FRSs are highly active opioids, almost identical to fentanyl, except for a tiny difference in their chemical structure created by changing a single ingredient during synthesis. The result of this tweak is a new potent opioid with the same deadly effects as fentanyl, and without class scheduling would be legal until it caused numerous deaths. Fentanyls are so toxic and lethal that they can be classified and have actually been used as chemical weapons. The lethal dose is merely 2 milligrams, equivalent to 5 grains of sand, meaning that 1 teaspoon can kill 2,000 people. That is what is in this packet of sugar. It could kill 2,000 people if this were fentanyl. Telling parents, tragically on more than one occasion, even friends of mine, that their child will never come home is the worst part of my job. In fact, the inspiration for FRS class scheduling arose out of the tragedy of my friend Lori Badura's son, Archie. Archie was an altar server with my daughters. He started with prescription opioids, then moved to heroin and unknowingly fentanyl. I resuscitated Archie on his second to last overdose. At that time, I pulled out a body bag, laid it down next to him, and warned him that that's where he'd end up if he didn't seek help. He stayed clean for 6 months until illicit fentanyl ended his life. One of the last things my friend Lori saw of her son Archie was him being zipped up into a body bag. Motivated to act by hundreds of such deaths, FRS scheduling legislation came together quickly and was enacted unanimously in Wisconsin legislature in 2017. DEA adopted it as national policy shortly thereafter, but only Congress can make it permanent. Some who oppose point to deaths from illicit fentanyl as proof that it doesn't work, but this is a misunderstanding of the facts. FRS scheduling does not address illicit fentanyl. It was never designed to do so. It only removes the incentive for legal chemical companies to create new FRSs, thus stopping them from ever existing in the first place. There is no quick and easy solution to the scourge of illicit fentanyl, but the solution to FRSs is a simple legislative fix, one that you have before you right now. At its core, FRS scheduling is not an extension of the war on drugs or a law enforcement strategy designed to incarcerate. There have been a total of 8 federal prosecutions under the language as of 2021, half of which had already been known to have ties to drug cartels. As well, there has never been a prosecution for a non-bioactive FRS because there are none. All fentanyl-related substances encountered to date have been found to have potent opioid activity. One of them is 7,000 times more potent than morphine. However, if Schedule I penalties were removed for FRS trafficking, then it would re-incentivize their creation and significantly weaken the law's most powerful proactive and preventative effects. There is a time and place for criminal justice reform, but FRS scheduling is not it. Some suggest FRS scheduling would have a negative impact on research. While theoretical, it has been addressed with stakeholder input and is supported by the very agencies and organizations representing academic scientific research, including the NIH, HHS, FDA, and the National Institute of Drug Abuse. The HALT Fentanyl Act would significantly loosen restrictions into studying all Schedule I substances, not just FRSs, and open up promising areas of substance abuse research. In conclusion, for the past 6 years, FRS scheduling has been federal policy. As the primary architect of the Wisconsin law, I could not be more pleased. In a few short years, the creation and distribution of new FRSs has ground to a halt. In our battle against fentanyl, the elimination of related substances that had previously escaped our scheduling and devastated communities across the nation is surely one bright spot. But Congress must take action and permanently close the spigot of FRSs. The fact is, you can't die from ingesting something never created, nor can you be incarcerated for trafficking something that does not exist. That's the beauty and simplicity of FRS scheduling. Thanks again for this time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Doctor, I'm going to introduce you, but I don't want to get your last name mispronounced. Is it Farfan?
Correct.
Okay, good. I guessed correctly. Be happy to hear your opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Durbin, and members of the committee. Thank you for conducting this hearing and the opportunity to explain why saving lives in North America requires productive engagement with Mexico. I appreciate the invitation to participate. I am an expert on organized crime and U.S.-Mexico security cooperation. As an alumna of the Fulbright program, I am convinced that transnational problems require transnational solutions. To the families who testified today, I acknowledge your grief. There are no actions that can reverse the tragedies you have experienced. My testimony today does not seek to invalidate yours. On the contrary, it is precisely because I have witnessed and collaborated with families on both sides of the border that have lost loved ones to overdoses, homicides, and disappearances that I am here to offer what I believe is a more helpful and sustainable path forward. On January 22nd, Secretary Rubio stated that America's foreign policy must be justified by answering 3 simple questions. Does it make America safer? Does it make America stronger? Does it make America more prosperous? As a scholar who has dedicated her professional career to studying and working towards constructive U.S.-Mexico relations, it is my strong professional opinion that the United States can only be safer, stronger, and prosperous if its neighbors are afforded the same opportunity. Suffering on both sides of the border is inextricably linked. The U.S. is facing one of its worst public health crises due to the availability of illicitly manufactured fentanyl, and Mexico faces its own lethal epidemic with 70% of homicides perpetrated with a firearm. More than 40% of Americans know someone who has died from an opioid overdose. Equally important, homicide is the leading cause of death for men ages 25 to 44, and the second cause of death for women ages 15 to 24 in Mexico. Worryingly, the urgency to save lives is reviving the worst policy failures of drugs. With thousands of lives at risk on both sides of the border, it is urgent that the U.S. and Mexico implement policies based on facts. Through their public sectors, civil society, and academia, both countries have developed robust evidence on how to acquire and maintain the health and safety of our communities. Fentanyl and firearms trafficking have changed dynamics in criminal markets, but these changes are not as simple as prevailing narratives of organized crime suggest. Even though places like Sinaloa, Mexico, have been portrayed as a Shangri-La for criminality, transnational drug trafficking in Mexico to the U.S. is not masterminded by three men hiding in the mountains. There is no special narco highway connecting the highlands of Sinaloa to the street of L.A. or Philadelphia, but actors in Mexico and the U.S. that take advantage of legal economies for the advancement of illicit activities. For example, the most recent data from the U.S. Sentencing Commission shows that for fiscal year 2023, 86.4% of people sentenced for fentanyl trafficking were U.S. citizens. Serious policy conversations on addressing mortality caused by synthetic drugs cannot be separate from firearms trafficking. Low production costs are often cited as a key reason suppliers moved away from heroin and into synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Overlooked in this conversation is that the same has happened with firearms and ammunition. The ease of acquiring firearms from the U.S. has lowered the cost of perpetrating violence for criminal groups in Mexico. Even though there are significant variations as to the frequency and ways criminal groups use violence, they all must issue credible threats on their ability to perpetrate this violence. Their businesses depend on it. The newer and the more sophisticated the armament is, then the more credible these threats become. Why intimidate potential victims with a rifle left over from the Mexican Revolution when your arsenal can include 50 caliber weapons? This strategy has paid off for organized crime, including those involved in fentanyl trafficking. According to data released by the ATF, of the firearms recovered in Mexico that were submitted for tracing, more than 2/3 were sourced from the U.S. Today, 74% of Mexicans believe criminal groups have more and better weapons than the armed forces. Access to legally trafficked weapons from the U.S. has allowed Mexican criminal groups to amass both a tremendous capacity for violence and a troubling capacity to intimidate. Simply stated, by failing to address firearms trafficking to Mexico, the U.S. is subsidizing the operating costs of criminal groups. It is as if cartels receive an annual aid package with state-of-the-art technology to carry out the crimes this Congress wants to stop. Our shared tragedies are two sides of the same coin. The silver lining is that there's no secret solution awaiting to be discovered. Actions available to Congress, like the Stop Arming Cartels Act, can contribute to stemming the devastating effects of this public health crisis and must be implemented through U.S.-Mexico security cooperation. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Sheriff Barnes.
Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Durbin, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I'm here representing the Major County Sheriffs of America, a professional law enforcement association of the 100 largest sheriffs in the nation, serving more than 1/3 of our nation's population. As Sheriff of Orange County, I lead an agency of more than 4,000 men and women serving 3.1 million residents. Orange County consistently ranks as one of the safest in the nation. But like every community, we have felt the devastating impacts of the fentanyl crisis. The fentanyl epidemic is one of the most pressing public safety and public health crises to impact our nation. In just a few short years, nationwide drug-related deaths have tripled, a direct correlation to the prevalence of fentanyl. While we saw a slight decrease in nationwide fatalities in 2023, the numbers remain alarmingly high, with annual deaths still approaching 100,000 annually. In California, we saw fentanyl deaths increase from 239 in 2016 to nearly 7,000 in 2023. Mexico-based cartels taking advantage of the crisis at our border have flooded our communities with deadly fentanyl. This is evident by the drug seizures made by my department's investigative teams. Over the past 4 years, these teams have seized a total of 1,551 pounds of fentanyl powder and over 3 million clandestine-produced fentanyl pills. What's even more alarming than the sheer volume is the dramatic increase in seizures during that same time period. Since 2021, my investigative teams seized 16,278 pills, whereas in 2024, that number skyrocketed to over 2 million, and that's just my agency alone. The fight against the fentanyl epidemic in California is incredibly challenging given our close proximity to the border, national drug trends, and our state's permissive drug laws. Proposition 47, passed in 2014, largely decriminalized most drug and property crimes. Our attempts to seek action by the state legislature largely fell on deaf ears. When we first saw the signs of fentanyl in 2025, we proposed legislation that enhanced penalties for trafficking fentanyl, similar to trafficking cocaine and heroin. This bill failed year after year after year, while deaths continued to increase. Sadly, in some instances, our proposal was met with ridicule by those far too devoted to extreme anti-incarceration policies. We also faced complications due to California sanctuary laws, which limits our communication with our federal partners. Despite this grim picture, there is hope. In Orange County, we have seen fentanyl deaths fall from a high of 717 in 2021 to 613 in 2023, while the state continues to rise. This progress is a result of our ongoing multifaceted strategy that focuses on both supply and demand for illicit drugs. The strategy includes investing dollars in narcotics teams and resources, working with the U.S. Attorney to prosecute individuals who sell drugs that result in the death of another, creating a new innovative drug education program taught in our schools. Since 2016, deputies who carry naloxone have resulted in over 600 lives saved within our community. In our jails, we have created SUD step-down units and have a medication-assisted treatment program serving more than 1,300 people every day. Congress can help this progress by moving forward many of the initiatives authored and supported by members of this committee. First and foremost, we must permanently schedule fentanyl analogs as a Schedule I drug. The House is taking up the Halt to Fentanyl Act this week. I want to thank Chairman Grassley and members of the committee for leading this effort in the Senate. HIDA funding increases would be a significant help. Funding for HIDA has remained static over the last 10 years. MCSA is grateful that members of this committee are prioritizing the reauthorization of HIDA. We look forward to working with you to advance legislation like the HIDA Enhancement Act, which would have reauthorized the HIDA program at $333 million annually. We need to protect law enforcement tools. MCSA strongly opposes legislation that would restrict or eliminate law enforcement's access to data necessary to investigate fentanyl trafficking organizations. We also advocate for providing law enforcement with lawful access to encrypted devices, which is crucial for identifying those responsible for distributing lethal fentanyl. Lastly, MCSA supports bipartisan legislation crucial for addressing SUD within the criminal justice system by focusing on continuous care, successful reintegration, and most importantly, sustained sobriety post-release from our jails. I'm honored to be here today, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Sheriff. I'll start by a round of questions, and then we'll turn to Senator Durbin. Mr. Puerta, Ms. Noring, I think it's only appropriate that we should express our condolences for your loss. You know, when things like this happen, I usually try to figure out, well, is there any way we can take something terrible and tragic and hopefully learn some lessons and make things better and save lives in the future? And so thank you for being courageous and telling your story. I know it's not easy, but it's very important for people across this country to understand how this can happen to them and their family. And having visited with a number of families in Texas, its various school districts, I've come to believe that this requires a layered approach, maybe starting at the kitchen table with awareness of our children to the threat, because none of them take these counterfeit drugs knowingly, at least knowing that it will take their lives, that it contains a contaminated fentanyl. But I do believe it's going to require all of us, from parents, families, to school districts and local law enforcement, state and federal law enforcement, and border security. Mr. Sheriff Barnes, it's my understanding that most of the chemicals that go into fentanyl basically have been traced back to China. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, Senator, there is an issue with precursor chemicals transiting from China through our U.S. ports and directly to China, yes.
And as I understand some of the announcements relating to the tariffs that President Trump has announced, his administration has said this isn't so much a trade policy as it is an anti-fentanyl policy to finally get the Chinese government's attention to do something about the precursors that emanate from that country. But then, as you point out, they make their way to Mexico, where the cartels are putting them into pill presses and making them look like relatively innocuous drugs, only to turn out to be contaminated with fentanyl and take the lives of people unbeknownst to them. Do you believe that with improved border security, we can begin to stop some of the flow of the illicit drugs coming across the border, including fentanyl?
Yes, Senator, what you described is a very complex system, almost a supply chain that starts in China using transit, going to Mexico, the pill presses. It's not doing any one thing, it's doing 12 things simultaneously. So I do believe that addressing this issue is much more complicated than just any one thing. The HALT Act is a great start, but when you look at the pill presses, pressing pills, that's one issue. The border obviously is going to be the most significant issue as we shut down the border and the pathway for illicit fentanyl to make its way back into the United States. But it's that and many other things that have to take place.
So I heard Senator Durbin's statement, which I disagree with, that says that the vast majority of the fentanyl comes across the ports of entry transported by American citizens. Is there anybody on the panel who subscribes to that point of view? Dr. Farfan, do you think any one of the 1.7 million gotaways during the last 4 years have been transporting fentanyl?
1.7 million of...
Well, during the Biden administration, out of the millions of people that were welcomed into the country and released, there were 1.7 million that appeared on various sensors, cameras and things like that, that evaded law enforcement and made their way into the interior of the United States. Do you think any one of those 1.7 million individuals that were evading law enforcement were transporting fentanyl?
I mean, to restate what I mentioned in my testimony, data from the U.S. Sentencing Commission shows that 86.4 people sentenced for fentanyl trafficking in fiscal year 2023 were U.S. citizens.
And that's not my question.
I would also add...
My question is about the people who evaded law enforcement. Is it possible that some of them, or maybe even many of them, were transporting illicit drugs, including fentanyl?
As someone who studies organized crime, that would be a really bad business decision. Drug traffickers deal with a lot of...
It sounds to me like a very profitable decision on the part of the cartels to evade law enforcement and to be able to deliver your drugs, your load into the United States, only to make a lot of money from it. Why is that a bad business decision?
Because from a business point of view, you would prefer to have smugglers who have a legal right to entry into the United States than an immigrant who is uncertain whether or not he or she is going to cross into the United States. So if you're looking at it from the point of view of, will we turn a profit or not in this particular shipment, putting your shipment in the hands of an immigrant who does not have a legal right to entry into the U.S. is actually a bad business decision.
Sheriff Barnes, you agree with that?
I do not. There's two different facets here. You have the trafficking of the narcotic, which is oftentimes in large bulk, and our experience in intervention and interdiction, as those are oftentimes residents of Mexico. The distribution of that or sales of it, I think to Dr. Farfan's point, might oftentimes be carried out by U.S. citizens in the drug trafficking market. So it's a combination of both. But the vast majority of the large quantities coming across, has been my experience, are being conducted by Mexican nationals. The distribution and sales inside the continental United States oftentimes has been carried out by U.S. citizens.
Thank you. Senator Durbin.
Thank you all for being here. How many of you would this be your first time to see the Senate Judiciary Committee? Would you raise your hand? a few of our witnesses and others the first time. This is an interesting committee. It represents the spectrum of politics in the United States Senate. We have the most Republicans and the most Democrats sitting on this committee. So you won't be surprised that many times we disagree. And that disagreement sometimes leads to good speeches, but very few laws. But there was an exception. 2 years ago, we took up this issue and started talking about what we could do to stop the spread of fentanyl and the deadly impact it's having on America. And we actually voted in this committee on a bipartisan basis unanimously for 5 measures that dealt with social media. Your point, Mrs. Noring, if Snapchat were a store on the corner selling fentanyl-laden Percocets, and it happened one time, and they could be sued, that would be the end of the story. But we learned through Section 230 that social media gets off the hook. Mrs. Noring, you're joining families, I understand, that are trying to hold them responsible for your son's death and other deaths as well. I couldn't support you more. Now let me tell you what happened. We passed bills in this committee holding big tech and social media responsible unanimously. Now there were 4 or 5 new members of the committee, but every member of the committee 2 years ago voted for it. Democrat and Republican, conservative and liberal, all voted for the measure. And what happened as a result of that combined bipartisan effort? Nothing. Nothing. Speeches. That's what happened. We failed as Democrats in the majority in the Senate. The Republicans failed as the majority in the House to pass any measure. There I said it. Democrats bear responsibility and Republicans as well. We've got to be honest about this. Why? Why would something as popular and as obvious as that fail before the Congress? Well, because there were powerful forces that have a lot of money at stake and don't want liability, who will piously and publicly say they love this measure. It makes all the sense in the world. And then when the doors close and they get a chance to speak to members individually, they flip and they take the opposite position and nothing happens. Chuck Grassley's my friend. I've gotten in trouble for that, but I'm proud of it. We go back a long ways. I went to him yesterday and said, this time you're the chairman. I'm the ranking Democrat. I'm here to help you pass legislation to do something. I'm sick and tired of excuses being made and people dying as a result of it. And I think it's time for us, on a bipartisan basis, to find things we agree with. Now, I don't know where the sources are. I think Dr. Farfan makes a valid argument. Sheriff Barnes, I respect very much your responsibility in law enforcement and have a different point of view. We may never resolve that basic question, but I think we can all resolve, we don't care where the hell it's coming from, we want it to stop. We want to stop it in China, we want to stop it in Mexico, we want to stop it in our backyards, and however it's getting into the United States. So to those who are familiar with this committee, this is where it has to start. We won't agree on every aspect, everything as a result of it, but we can agree on some basics that make a difference. Mrs. Noring, you've testified before about your son and the loss of his life. Senator Klobuchar told me that. And I'd like to ask you what the families are doing that you've gathered with to hold Snapchat and others liable.
So the families and I, Mr. Puerta, Amy Neville sitting behind me, we filed suit against Snapchat. We are in the process of making it through the courts as we speak. There's, oh my God, how many? They have hundreds of cases behind ours. For a while, it was looking pretty grim. I mean, Snapchat has been immune for so long, and it's now making its way through. We just got word that we're going into discovery.
Mr. Puerta?
Yes, sir. It passed out of Judge Lawrence Riff on January 4th of 2023, I believe, accepted the lawsuit, and I'm sorry, 2024, not on the basis of free speech, but on the basis of product design. That went on to the appellate court in California, and the appellate court ruled in our favor for the lawsuit to go forward. So right now, we are in discovery. No other lawsuit against any major social media company has gotten as far as ours, sir.
I wish you well. I'll close by saying we're dealing with fentanyl and the deadly aspects of that drug, and we're also dealing with sexual exploitation, particularly of children. And a number of members here have shown real leadership. Senator Blackburn on the Republican side, and Senator Blumenthal on the Democratic side especially. We all have bills. We can do this. Hold this responsible. Don't just come and leave and think nothing's going to happen. It's our job to make sure it does happen and do the right thing for you and your families. Thank you very much.
And I thank Senator Durbin for bringing up our conversation that we had yesterday on the floor of the United States Senate, and I suggested to him then, but I want our staffs to know that our staff should sit down and see what can be worked out. Let's do it. You bet. Now I'll ask questions, then I'll call on Klobuchar. Leading up to this hearing, my office received 58 letters from grieving families who lost loved ones to fentanyl. I want to offer those letters into the record and thank the families for writing them. So without objection, that will be done. One mother wrote, quote, "Families like mine have been sharing our stories of loss to this poison since before 2018, hoping to ignite action among our leaders. Tragically, despite hundreds of thousands of stories like mine or over countless years, we have yet to see a massive, unified effort necessary to stop this poisoning of our generations," end of quote. Many of these letters urge Congress to pass the legislation that goes by the acronym HALT Fentanyl, which would make the class scheduling of fentanyls related substances very permanent. Mr. Purda, Dr. Westlake, Sheriff Barnes, in that order, could you each briefly explain why permanent class scheduling is important to tackling this crisis?
I believe that it'll increase penalties for trafficking and distribution. It also will streamline prosecution by removing the burden of proving whether a particular fentanyl analog is harmful. It would be illegal by default, and it would give authorities greater flexibility as well to target emerging fentanyl analogs before they flood the market.
Dr. Westlake.
So I think it goes back to the whole point of me coming up with this idea was to stop the creation of these. So what this does is it stops them from existing to begin with. We looked at all the possible bioactive modifications to the fentanyl molecule and surgically scheduled those modifications. And so what it's done, and it's proven to be done so, is it stopped them from existing in the first place. So no one's going to jail for them. No one's dying from them because they don't exist. It's the perfect form of prevention. There's a lot of disease. With the disease, the best place to hit a disease is at the beginning. If you can stop a diabetic from becoming diabetic, they're not going to have the problems of having their leg amputated or being on dialysis later. That's what this does, is this stops the very existence. It's one spigot. Illicit fentanyl is a huge fire hydrant. This is one spigot, but Congress can turn it off, and that's what they should do.
Thank you. Sheriff Barnes?
Mr. Chairman Grassley, I'll summarize the two previous speakers this way. First, with the Controlled Substances Act, not including it as an analog, we saw this happen with methamphetamines back in the 90s, where there were analog knockoffs, and it made it very difficult for prosecution. Most of our state's laws are tied to the Controlled Substances Act, so preclusion of it would eliminate the probability of prosecuting somebody for it. And I'll agree with the doctor when he said if we include these now, it will disincentivize the knockoffs of the analogs because they will be by default included, which will solve the previous problem of prosecutions at the state level.
Sheriff Barnes, at the Center for Disease Control reported that 100,000 Americans died each year from drug overdoses. As I've said, 75,000 of those related to fentanyl, and that's been at least over the last 4 years. We've only recently seen a decline. Do you think that we've got a handle on the emergency drug threats, and if not, what do we need to do better?
Chair Grassley, I don't believe we have a handle on it. I think we're finally responding to it. The CDC first reported back in 2014, just over 10 years ago, 4% of the nation's drug-related deaths were attributed to fentanyl. 5 years later, that increased tenfold to 40% and almost doubled all over again in the 5 years since. We've seen this coming. We've been non-responsive to it. So I think that we have seen an emergent trend. We have been playing defense. As I shared earlier with my response to Senator Cornyn, I believe it's not doing any one thing. It's doing a dozen things simultaneously that's going to put us in a better position. And first and foremost, as much as people don't want to recognize it, we have to deal with the demand side of this issue north of the border with our addiction crisis in this country to get people in sobriety, which will then deal with the narcotics economy on the supply chain side of it by eliminating the need for the narcotics north of the border. I think that's the most important thing that we can do as a country.
My last question will have to be to Mr. Perta. Thank you for sharing your son's story. I said that before, but we can't say it too often. Some folks have said that scheduling fentanyl-related substances as a class creates a system that over-criminalizes drug crimes. What's your response to that?
I'm Hispanic American. I'm Colombian American. And I believe that a lot, if not the grand majority of the children who are dying today. The New England Journal of Medicine came out with a report in January of 2024, and they came to the conclusion that in 2020, we were losing 22 non-addicted children in the United States of America per week between the ages of 14 and 18 years of age, mostly driven by illicit fentanyl pills that were deceptively sold to them. Are we to stand back and not do anything because we're going to over-criminalize this? Every time I get up in the morning, I look in the mirror, I see a brown man, but I see an American man as well. And I see that the injustice, also, this crisis is decimating minorities as well. This does not discriminate on your age, it doesn't discriminate your race, it doesn't discriminate your religion, your socioeconomic status, it doesn't discriminate. It's taking everyone by storm. And we as a nation have to come together and we have to do something to stop this. In 2020 with COVID-19, we all knew that we had to stand 6 feet away from each other, that we had to wash our hands and we had to wear a mask over our faces. Why does the American public not know about this crisis that is a national security crisis as well, sir? We have a lot to do, but I'm telling you right now, this is taking everyone by storm and something has to be done.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Noring, I think everyone was touched by your story and your bravery for coming forward. I've been honored to get to know you, and I want to thank you for everything that you've done. As you said, all the hopes and dreams we as parents had for Devin were erased in the blink of an eye, and no mom should have to bury their kid. Those were your words, and I know the words of all of your friends there that stand there to support you and have had their own pain. All he did was buy a pill off Snapchat. He thought it was a Percocet. You were there for that testimony with the tech executives, and there's a bunch of us here that have had some, battle wounds going after them when we just want to put some sensible rules in place or get rid of this legal protections that they have that other companies do not have, as you so well pointed out, but no wounds compared to what you have. You heard their testimony back then in January 2024. Do you think the social media companies are doing enough to stop the sale of drugs to kids online?
I do not think that they are doing enough. In fact, it's still continuing. I was introduced to 2 new families just last week from Minnesota, both with ties to fentanyl, with their children passing. So no, they're not doing enough. They could be doing more. I was just informed that Evan Spiegel is in support of the Cooper Davis and Devin Noring Act, and I must ask then, if you are in such support of it, all these companies are in support of the Kids Online Safety Act, why aren't they implementing those features and doing the job now? Why do we have to come before Congress and have you make them do that?
Good point. Thank you. Mr. Puerta, do you think we should get rid of or reform Section 230 in some way just to make this very clear?
Absolutely, Senator Klobuchar. In 1996, as we all know, this legislative body came up with the Section 230C of the Communications Decency Act, and what it was meant to do was to protect free speech. But what's happening right now is cannot be free speech when you have a drug dealer selling illicit fentanyl to unsuspecting children. That's not free speech. Or a grown man sending unwarranted pictures to young ladies. Sexual exploitation. This is not free speech. This is criminal behavior. And like Ms. Noring said, if it's a criminal act in the real world, then it should be as well in the social media world.
So you're looking for that reform, which also I appreciate you bringing up. Senator Cruz and I have this Take It Down Act. There's a number of other bills involving pornography as well. Sheriff Barnes, do you agree that we should, thank you for your testimony and being here, funding as we look into this next year, funding for law enforcement, do you think that that is important to take on this fentanyl crisis as well as the HIDA program that helps your deputies get fentanyl off the streets?
Senator, yes, thank you for that question. The HIDA funding has been stagnant, stale for the last 10 years, hasn't grown. If you look at the time value of money, it's about 1/3 reduction over the last 10 years, and our costs have gone up, so it's about 50 cents on the dollar. It's not a fully funded program. My HIDA program is funded at about 1/6 of the costs that we put into it, and mostly it's subsidized through my investment of stabilizing that as other municipal agencies have withdrawn personnel. So yes, I think at the nation's worst time in history, we have to reinvest those monies. We have to look at the use of those monies, and I think we have to look at what I call a super HIDA. The original intent of the gateway HIDA is to invest on the greatest offense, which is our border HIDAs, and stop as much of the drugs as we can at the border before they make it into the continental United States.
Thank you. Dr. Westlake, why does class-wide scheduling reduce the incentives for drug cartels to create new fentanyl variants?
So the incentives were there before because when they initially created these under the normal Controlled Substances Act, they were legal, so you could modify it. Instead of putting an ethyl group in, you could put a methyl group in. It's a legal substance. I was on the Controlled Substance Board in Wisconsin in 2015. We had 9 different fentanyl variants, fentanyl-related substances that were killing people. We could schedule them immediately, and then they were illegal. And when you schedule them and make them illegal, there's no incentive for them to be created anymore. And there's a cookbook of changes that you can do easily, look up the research to find what different chemicals to use. So it literally just stops the incentive. It doesn't stop illicit fentanyl incentive, but it closes the spigot of fentanyl-related substances.
Thank you. One last point, Ms. Noring, and we'll talk more in this committee. I am so pleased that Senator Grassley and Durbin will lead this together on some of the social media issues. They go way beyond the ones we've talked about now. But you've also embarked on an education campaign along with a lot of our sheriffs in Minnesota that I think has been pretty effective, going back in the schools with one pill can kill. 10 seconds on that, and I'm out of time.
We have to do it because nobody else is doing it. It falls back on us. If we sit by and say nothing, children continue to die. So we feel it's our obligation to get out there, educate our community and the children, because as Ranking Chair mentioned, the conversation really begins at home. It really has to begin at home.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of you for being here and sharing your insights today. The fentanyl crisis has infiltrated our homes, our schools, our communities, our workplaces, taking lives and destroying lives at an unprecedented rate. In Utah, fentanyl-related deaths are rising, and they've become a devastating reality for far too many families. Seems everyone knows someone, and in Utah, in many cases, almost everyone is related to someone who has been impacted adversely, if not lost their life due to this crisis. From 2014 through 2023, deaths involving fentanyl surged by a staggering 116%. And in 2023 alone, over 600 times in Utah, someone returned home to find their son, their daughter, their sibling, their parent had lost their life due to a tragic opioid overdose. This marks a dramatic increase from just 23 deaths in 2014. Now, in 2023, Utah set a record for the most fentanyl pills seized in a year. Then, by the very next year, just 6 months into the year, by July of 2024, the DEA's Rocky Mountain Field Division had already confiscated well in excess of that, close to 800,000 pills, surpassing the entire year, record-breaking year of 2023, which recorded 664,200 pills in just 6 months. The sharp increase in fentanyl-related deaths has significantly outpaced the decline that we've seen in deaths from prescription opioids. So we took all these steps as the crisis emerged as significant, roughly a decade or so. And then all of a sudden, we've seen the number of deaths from the non-prescription related drugs exceeding those. The number of fentanyl-related deaths more than doubled between 2019 and 2020 alone, and that trend has only gotten worse since then. The victims of this deadly scourge include our loved ones, our neighbors, our friends. Mr. Puerta and Ms. Noring, thank you for being with us today, in particular, and for sharing your testimonies. And deeply sorry for your loss. No parent should ever have to face that heartbreak, and heartbroken for you that you have. President Trump has prioritized securing our borders and prosecuting violent gang members, traffic fentanyl into our country and throughout our communities. And in Congress, I hope we can stand with him in his effort to make America safe again. Sheriff Barnes, I'd like to start with you. From October 2023 to October 2024, officials seized roughly 22,000 pounds of fentanyl at U.S. ports of entry, equaling nearly 1.1 million doses. Now, according to the DEA, ingesting just 2 milligrams of fentanyl can be fatal. Federal officials estimate that at most 10% of fentanyl crossing from Mexico is actually caught. Do you believe the Biden administration's open border policies contributed to that rapid increase of fentanyl entering the United States illegally? And if so, what can be done to reverse that now?
Senator, unequivocally, the crisis at the border that allowed the drug trafficking organizations, the cartels, opened a gateway, and they exposed our weaknesses and used it against us. So yes, the open border policy undoubtedly resulted in harms to this country through the trafficking of not just fentanyl, but human trafficking and other things that put us at risk. Not to mention the 1.4 million gotaways that we have no idea who they are. There's so much greater risk beyond fentanyl that were created as a result of the open border policies.
I appreciate what you've done in Orange County. It's sparked the creation of all kinds of memes that are in fact flattering of your county and the efforts that you have undertaken there. Memes suggesting, for example, that when people cross into your county, they're sometimes shocked to learn at the extent to which you're willing to enforce the law. And yet, California law in some meaningful ways has impeded your ability to enforce the law and make Californians safer. What can you tell us about that and how sanctuary jurisdictions are adversely affecting your work?
Well, first, as far as laws, in 2014, we had Prop 47 passed. We had Prop 36 passed, which reversed a lot of the Prop 47 impacts. We're already seeing incarceration rates go up, which is on repeated crime. So we're seeing some positive results there with accountability being restored back into California. Regarding the issues, your second question was specific to immigration
Sanctuary
policy.
jurisdictions in California law.
I can speak for myself. I cooperate with our federal partners to the extent allowable by law. I believe those are creating harms by restricting our ability to communicate. I have to release people back into our communities that reoffend to come right back. I do not believe they should be allowed to do that. I would support changing that, challenge that law, and give us the ability to cooperate with our federal partners.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for having this hearing and the ranking member as well. This cause should unite us across the aisle, and I think today's hearing reflects that kind of bipartisan support for stronger measures to stop social media from spreading and selling and distributing fentanyl and other toxic chemicals. And I've been pleased to work across the aisle with Senator Blackburn on the Kids Online Safety Bill, which would dramatically and significantly reduce the threat of these drugs, and we're going to be reintroducing that bill, I hope, again, with the kind of support that was reflected in the 90 1-3 vote in the United States Senate supporting that bill. Been pleased to work with Senator Cruz and Senator Graham on measures that would reduce that threat of social media and others on the committee, the ranking member and yourself. I want to raise an issue first that I think is tremendously relevant to this topic because it indicates a diminution, an undercutting of law enforcement, which is the mass purges that are taking place among the ranks of our FBI. There's no denying that FBI agents have been fired, have been suspended, and otherwise disciplined for assignments that they took on orders in connection with certain criminal investigations. Those massive purges are directly contrary to the assurances we were given by Kash Patel. He said to us, when I asked him directly, pointedly, all FBI employees will be protected against political retribution. This retribution undermines enforcement by the FBI of drug cases and terrorism and other criminal cases. I asked, Mr. Chairman, that we call back Kash Patel to explain how he could deny that there would be political retribution when the next day, in fact, these massive purges began. Likewise, Mr. Chairman, I'm asking questions about the reassignment, apparently, of AUSAs, assistant U.S. attorneys, from drug cases to immigration cases. We need them on the front lines prosecuting drug cases. We need FBI agents on the front lines. We can all agree, I think, on a bipartisan basis, that assistant U.S. attorneys and other federal prosecutors ought to be at the tip of the spear, and that this reassignment poses a threat to law enforcement of exactly the prohibitions and the dangers that bring us here today. And I hope that we can unite around that cause, bring back Kash Patel for a second hearing, and jointly do our oversight, which we are mandated to do on this topic. I want to thank our witnesses. Mr. Puerta, Ms. Noring, you have suffered losses that are unspeakable. And all of you who are so deeply engaged, hands-on, the story about the body bag, Mr. Westlake, I think I will always remember. I would like to ask Mr. Noring, Mr. Puerta, about the Kids Online Safety Bill and whether you believe that our leadership here in the Senate and most important in the House, which was responsible for stopping it after the 91-3 vote here in the Senate, should support this legislation, the Kids Online Safety Act, which had such strong bipartisan backing here in the United States Senate. Will it make a difference? Do you think the House leadership ought to support it?
Thank you for that question, Senator Blumenthal. I firmly believe that the House should support it. 91-3 coming out of this Senate body is something that is so unheard of. And it happened on my birthday last year. It was the first time in years I'd ever felt some sort of peace. I finally felt hopeful that something was going to be done to protect our children. And to see it fail in the House, not even get out of the committee, it's absurd because it's putting more children at harm, not just from fentanyl, but all the other harms that are out there. So I thank you for your continued support on this bill.
Thank you. Mr. Puerta?
A lot of these social media companies are driving these harmful algorithms to our children, and many nefarious actors are taking advantage of that. And the act does exactly that. The Kids Online Safety Act is to try to protect them from all of this nefarious activity and these harmful algorithms that are reaching them on a daily basis. So yes, I absolutely back that bill and back you in anything that we can do to try to get it over the finish line.
Thank you.
Before I call on Senator Cruz, when Cruz is done, I'm going to leave for another meeting. Senator Britt is going to take over, so if you come over here and sit now, I'd appreciate it. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, soon to be Madam Chairman. Thank you for hosting this very important debate and this very important hearing. The American people in November issued a clear and unequivocal mandate. The open borders we've had for the last 4 years must be closed. We can no longer allow criminals and cartels and gang members and deadly drugs to stream across our border. And President Trump has been working every day since he was sworn in to keep his promise to secure the border. He declared a national emergency on the southern border. He reinstated the Remain in Mexico policy. And just yesterday, President Trump negotiated that Mexico will station 10,000 troops at the southern border to help stop the flow of fentanyl into the United States. President Trump is doing his part to meet the mandate from the voters. We also in Congress must do our part to meet that mandate. That's why I hope that this committee supports the Halt Fentanyl Act, an act to permanently classify fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I under the Controlled Substances Act. Fentanyl and its analogs are extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily destructive. Congress and the American people don't talk enough about fentanyl's dangerousness. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Dr. Westlake, you are an emergency room physician. How much fentanyl does it take to kill an adult human being?
Well, this is 2,000, enough to kill 2,000 people. So it's 4 to 5 grains of sand is a lethal dose for an opioid-naive patient.
2 milligrams
Yeah.
is what it takes. If you see on this photograph a penny, we all know the size of a penny, and those couple of flakes there are enough to kill an adult human being. Dr. Westlake, last year, approximately how many people died due to fentanyl overdoses?
I believe it was around 70,000.
This means, on average, 6,250 people died every single month due to fentanyl. And it's a number that tragically has skyrocketed during the Biden-Harris years. Sheriff Barnes, as a law enforcement professional on the front lines of the battle with fentanyl, can I ask you how many pounds of fentanyl were seized by Customs and Border Patrol at the border last year?
Senator, unfortunately, I can't answer that. I can answer for my organization, but I know it was a lot and growing.
It's 2,250 pounds of fentanyl. An astronomical figure. And let's actually, I want to put this into context. This packet of Sweet and Low. This packet, if it were full of fentanyl, could kill 500 people. Now take a look at this container. It's a container we're all familiar with. If this were full of fentanyl, it could kill 368,500 people. That's more than the entire population of Corpus Christi, Texas, or Lubbock, Texas. Now let's look at another packet. Something, again, all of us likely have in our kitchen. This single bag of sugar, if it were filled with fentanyl, could kill 905,000 people. Almost 1 million people. This single bag could take out the entire population of Austin, Texas, the capital of my home state. Now imagine 562 of these bags. That's how much fentanyl came into the United States of America in a single month. And how many lethal doses of fentanyl is in 562 bags? What came in a single month last year? 510 million lethal doses. In 1 month, more fentanyl came into America than it would be needed to kill every single man, woman, and child in the United States. This is a crisis we have to solve. Mr. Puerta, Ms. Noring, thank you both for being here. Thank you for your courage. I will say, as the father of 2 teenage girls, lived a nightmare that every parent is terrified of. What I would ask is, what would you say to parents at home? What do parents at home know about this? What do teenagers and kids at home need to know about the dangers of fentanyl?
If you don't think this can happen to you, I'm very sorry, but you're very sorely mistaken. This is taking everybody by storm. That's what I would tell every single parent. Due to the stigma of addiction and overdose, though, most people think that this could not affect their family because either they don't have somebody who's addicted to drugs in their family or somebody who's using drugs on a recreational basis. But children make mistakes. I do not condone my son Daniel wanting to self-medicate during the height of the pandemic for his whatever was happening in his head. I do not condone it. He made a mistake, and the price that he paid was his life. Children are supposed to make mistakes but not die from them, period. And that's what's happening every single day, 22 times a week in the United States of America. We have to stop this.
Amen. Ms. Doring?
I echo the same thing. You know, that whole saying, not my kid, take that out of your vocabulary because it could very well be your kid. We had every conversation with our children about addiction because unfortunately on both sides of our family, we have members that suffer from STD. But nobody at the time was talking about this crisis. So I feel robbed of a conversation I could have had with my son that could have saved his life. So take that out of your vocabulary. This very well could happen, and it can very well happen. These dealers are on Snapchat, all platforms, every single one of them. And we've reported them. I know Mr. Puerta's reported them, and I shouldn't put a number out there, but majority of the time it comes back as this does not violate our standards. So monitor your children's social media accounts. Have the conversation. It could save your child's life.
Thank you for your courage.
Senator.
Thank you.
Mr. Shift.
Thank you all for being here, and I just want to express my heartbreak at hearing about the loss of your sons. I can't imagine what you've gone through, and like every parent of college-age kids or high school-age kids, I've had those conversations with my kids, and I'm grateful that you're here and willing to share your experience, which is so important for us to hear. I have a couple questions. Doctor, I want to ask you, because one of the concerns I heard about the bill when it was in the House was a concern that it could inhibit research. You made a comment, but you made it too quickly for me to catch, about NIH's view or others. Is there a need to have language to make sure that the research can go on? Or do you feel that is a non-issue for some reason?
No, so this is a compromise bill. The initial language that came out was just pure scheduling language. And then when there was concerns that it could impact research negatively, the scheduling component or the research component was added. And that was supported through the first Trump ONDCP and then through the Biden ONDCP. The research accommodations that were reached significantly open up all Schedule I research, not just into fentanyl-related substances, but into all Schedule Is. So and that's why they support it. NIH, HHS, FDA, NIDA.
So that's been incorporated into a new version of the bill?
Correct, in the halt fentanyl version. Yeah,
Gotcha.
it is in the halt fentanyl bill.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. And if I could ask you, Mr. Puerta and Ms. Noring, what do you think is working in terms of trying to educate families, young people, and what more do we need to do? And I fully agree with the need to make sure that the companies that are using their platforms or allowing their platforms to be used need to be held liable and accountable. But what do you think is working in terms of educating both families but also schools and others about how they should incorporate this into their teaching and to have the supplies on hand necessary to deal with emergencies?
At Stop the Void, our organization, along with the project Facing Fentanyl, we have a documentary called Dead on Arrival. You can find it at stopthevoid.org. It's a 22-minute documentary that we use in junior high schools and in high schools across this nation. In California, all of Orange County high schools have done it, with Amy Neville presenting the documentary. I think the education and awareness is key in abating these senseless drug deaths, because these kids just don't know. They don't know what they're ingesting. They're dying because they've been deceptively sold a counterfeit pill that they think is a pharmaceutical grade oxycodone, for example, and it turns out that it's a fake pill and they end up dying. First time use. Education and awareness is working, but we're just a small organization. We need to do this nationwide. Mr. Steve Hilson says it all the time. With COVID-19, we all knew that we had to wash our hands and have a mask over our faces. Why on the national or on the federal level, why have we not had a PSA campaign of sorts of warning all parents and children of the impending danger of illicit, or should I say recreational drug use? I think that's very key because, again, due to the stigma of addiction and overdose, most kids and most parents don't understand the problem of what it is. I also feel that interdiction is helping a lot, as well as naloxone. So the three-pronged approach: education and awareness, interdiction, and naloxone. Widely available naloxone on college campuses and high schools, I think, is really helping out the situation a little bit, but we need to do a lot more.
Thank you. Ms. Norrie?
I agree. The education and awareness piece is huge, but we face roadblocks all the time with schools that don't want us to come into their schools because they feel that we may basically, in a sense, give kids the idea that it's okay to go do these drugs, and it's so ridiculous. We've shown Dead on Arrival. I'm a former member of Void, so we do that oftentimes. We also show the Come Back Home film that the Alexander Neville Foundation produced, which is told from the youth preventative side of things. And I think when you hear from the youth directly on this crisis, that is so impactful. We also pride ourselves on going out into the community, doing community events, bringing the community together, doing naloxone trainings, getting that information out there, really reducing the stigma of this crisis, because I say poisoning while so many say overdose. You will never hear me say that my son overdosed, because my son was poisoned. I know that if my son knew that that pill was going to take his life, he would have never have taken it. Like Senator Klobuchar said, all of my hopes and dreams for him and his future are gone. But not only that, his dreams erased in the blink of an eye. So, and I mirror your sentiment. Our government really needs to step up and start taking the handle on this, because we're just parents out there. We're spending a lot of money out of our pockets. Most of us don't qualify for public grants or anything like that. Why don't we have the campaign? Kids are dying. You would think that that would be a priority, and yet it's us out there doing the work, and we will do it because that means potentially a child's life is saved.
Thank you both again for your testimony, and to all the parents who are here representing their children. I want to thank you for your advocacy. Really important for us to see you and to hear you, and thank you for your testimony. Yield back.
Couldn't agree more. I'd like to enter into the record a letter of support from 9 organizations that represent the medical community, led by the American Society of Neurosurgeons. Their letter commends our bipartisan leadership in addressing the fentanyl epidemic and notes that the temporary schedule classification is not sustainable. They note that, quote, continually revisiting its classification creates confusion about the dangers of these substances and hampers efforts to address the crisis comprehensively, end quote. I ask unanimous consent that the entirety of their letter be entered into the record. Thank you. Thank you. Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to all of the witnesses for being here. Ms. Norrie, Mr. Puerta, I want to particularly thank you and thank other parents who I think are in the room today. You've highlighted the true crisis that we're facing. You know, my home state of Missouri in 2022 alone, child fatalities from fentanyl doubled just in 2022. Deaths for children under the age of 5 increased by more than 500% in my state, and fentanyl is our leading cause of death now in the state of Missouri. So the fates that your families have endured are being replicated all over my state as well. And that's really a wake-up call, I think, for this body to do something. And we absolutely do need to seal the border against those who would traffic illicit drugs into this country, and we need to prosecute those who are doing it. But I want to zero in on something that you both talked about, and you in particular, Ms. Norrie. where your own children or your child was exposed to these illegal drugs, namely
accusations, just to add a little bit of color to what a decent person he was. I think the place where we can make the most progress, as Ranking Member Durbin mentioned earlier, is with Section 230. I applaud the litigation that is going forward. I applaud the lawyers who've been able to negotiate the various hurdles that Congress has erected to the American system of justice having its role in dealing with these deaths and with these tragedies. I think there's bipartisan support for repealing Section 230. I am on for that, and I think the sooner we do that, the better we are. It is simply wrong for these enormously powerful social media entities to have rights to do harm to Americans without accountability that no other entity shares. So they've blown any excuse to maintain that privileged position with their behavior, in my view. So let's go for 230. And with respect to enforcement, reassigning FBI, DOJ, and DEA agents off this task, I don't think is a good idea. We'll find out more about how many were reassigned. Cutting FinCEN dollars, I think, is a big mistake. And I'll close with a question to Dr. Farfan. It's been my experience as a prosecutor for many years that we put a lot of attention into interdicting distribution networks for drugs. By comparison, we put a very small effort into interdicting the financial return of that money, the hiding of that money in international accounts and international dark money banking and covert other systems. What more should we be doing to get after the financing of these cartels? And is the gun traffic back to them part of the payment to them for the drugs that we try to interdict coming in?
And we are out of time, so if you can keep your response brief, thank you.
Well, customarily, as long as the question is asked before the clock runs out, the witness gets to answer it.
Thank you. So in terms of the illicit flows, certainly there's, because money laundering takes place across jurisdictions, it requires also cooperation. So the best cases that we have seen between, for instance, Mexico and the United States of dismantling money laundering operations had to do with working together between the two governments. Now, I understand this is not easily done, but these are the most effective cases of money laundering. Certainly, firearms trafficking is part of that. There's a clear notion that drugs normally come from the South and firearms and money flow from the United States to Mexico. And again, there's a linkage between these criminal markets. And if we want to save lives by tackling the fentanyl supply, then there should also be paying attention to money and firearms.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate your courtesy.
With regards to social media, I appreciate the work that's been done on this committee, and certainly Senator Blumenthal and Senator Blackburn and the work that they have done in a bipartisan way to address this. As a mom of a 14 and a 15-year-old who knows that Snapchat is used to tell people which color uniform they're supposed to wear that day, or they use it to figure out where friends are going to meet. You think that this can happen, to your point, to anyone, anywhere, and I am so grateful for you both using your voice to speak up and speak directly into this issue, so thank you. I do want to address complaints about the brief pause on grant funding. It's important to know that this was temporary. It was a temporary pause, and to the extent permitted by law, law enforcement grants aren't handed out during this time of year. Our constituent needs will continue to be taken care of while President Trump delivers on the job voters elected him to do. Voters ask him to grow our economy, protect our communities, and ensure that taxpayer dollars are used wisely. Examining spending is part of that. President Trump has always backed the blue, just like Chairman Grassley and just like myself. Additionally, one more thing before we move on, I'd like to enter into the record a letter of support from 11 law enforcement organizations for Halt Fentanyl, including the National Narcotic Officers Association, which is in town for its annual conference. I am pleased that we have several of their members here today as guests of Chairman Grassley. These organizations represent constituents from each of our states and a significant portion of our nation's federal, state, and local law enforcement communities. As their letter says, for the sake of public safety, we must pass Halt Fentanyl Act. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairman. Mr. Puerto, I am so sorry for your loss. I noted that you said your son had an ADHD diagnosis, and I was looking at figures last week from our TennCare, which is our Medicaid program in Tennessee, and there are over 400,000 children in our state of 7 million people that have an ADHD diagnosis. I know that we have so many times seen kids that to deal with the pain would try to get something, and my heart breaks for you. And I hope we take a deeper dive, and that if confirmed, that Robert F. Kennedy will take a deeper dive into how we medicate children and work on these issues. And thank you for the good work that you were doing. Ms. Noring, thank you for your support of COSA. I appreciate that, and we share your heartbreak. I stepped out of committee to go speak to a group of children that are here for Wired Human and are working on this issue. And the work that you and other parents have done has encouraged these children to stand up and be a resource to their peers and to help them through this issue. So I thank you for that good work that you are doing. Sheriff Barnes, I want to talk with you about HIDA. I know that in 22, we had 134 criminal organizations that were dismantled by HIDA. We had over 8,700 kilograms of drugs that were removed nationally. And in Tennessee, our TBI director, Director Roush, every time he sees me, he says, we have to reauthorize HIDA because it is effective. And the Appalachia HIDA task force operating in Tennessee was responsible for moving $51 million street value of drugs off the market. So talk for a minute about why it is crucial that HIDA be reauthorized for law enforcement officers like you.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn, and thank you for the reauthorization of HIDA. It's very important, and Director Roush is a good friend.
He's a good man.
I will summarize it this way. At this time in our nation's history, the worst time of our narcotics trafficking and deaths, this is not the time to disenfranchise or divest from the HIDA program. HIDA programs are national. They rely on local law enforcement task forces and contributions. The HIDA funding doesn't really fully fund the HIDA programs. It offsets those contributions from locals. And right now, with our municipal agencies having hiring problems, they're stepping away from the HIDA programs. Keeping them staffed is very difficult. So that reauthorization is very critical to keep the glue together, to keep the HIDA programs running.
I have talked to, and I want to stay with you, Sheriff, talked to some of our law enforcement agencies, and they have talked about sanctuary city policies, and I know that Senator Lee brought this up with you, but it seems that in a sanctuary city to go after these traffickers, that it is more difficult, that sometimes you have to find workarounds. And I would love for you to talk for just a minute about what we can do that would help you all as you try to deal with these sanctuary cities to get these drugs off the street.
Senator, it's even worse for me in California because of Senate Bill 54 passed about 6 years ago. that prohibits my dialogue with federal partners on immigration issues. I have the ability to turn our high-level offenders only to ICE. They don't always pick them up, which requires me to release them back in the communities in which they reoffend, oftentimes with the communities that they preyed upon. I'm a supporter of abolishing that SB 54 movement. We have to be able to cooperate with our federal partners, and I think if we hold these criminals accountable, this isn't about the general public, those are entrusted to my care in my jail, and the safest environment to transfer them over to ICE's custody will keep our communities safe, especially those immigrant communities, from them returning to and preying upon them.
And, so many people will say when they get back out, when they evade law enforcement in these sanctuary cities, that they really return even more committed to abuse people in those communities where they have been trafficking those drugs, to pick up the pace of selling the drugs. And I look at these sanctuary city policies and I think how difficult it makes your job when you're trying to keep our community safe. And we thank you for the work that you're doing. We thank each of you for being here today. Senator Blumenthal and I are going to continue to push COSA to get, as you said, Ms. Noring, that foundational law that will allow us to hold social media to account. Thank you all. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Schmidt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Two hearings and you're chairing the committee. This is, wow, it's amazing. Thank you for recognizing me. First of all, as a parent of 3 young children, or now they're not so young now, teenage girls, and my son Stephen, who's 20, thank you for being here and sharing your stories. I can't imagine how difficult it is to do this, but it is incredibly effective, I think, when you do show up and you share those stories. It humanizes something and an issue that can very often become about different things other than the actual human impact. And, from my perspective, the job I had before this, I was an attorney general in the state of Missouri and actually served with Senator Moody. And we went down to the border and learned a lot about the activity and how the cartels, and it's not just the drugs, and there are obviously the drugs, but the value of the human trafficking alone, and this is a few years ago, was $100 million a week. A week. That is not that we're not even talking about the value of the drugs that they're moving, and the zones of influence that they have into the interior of the United States. This is a serious crisis, and obviously it's killing too many of our young men and women in this country and communities all across the country. It gets overused now, but every state truly is a border state when it comes to this. And sort of in that vein about the cartels, I do want to ask you, Doctor, in your view, is Mexico doing enough from a law enforcement perspective as it relates to the cartels?
I think both countries need to do more.
No, Mexico. I'm asking about Mexico. There's a lot we need to do, but I won't ask specifically. I mean, part of the reason you're here is to speak to that relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. But from your view, are they doing enough?
I think there's definitely more that can be done by Mexico.
And what would that be?
I think he's working closer with U.S. counterparts. I think he's also having this diagnosis of this connection between these criminal markets, firearms trafficking, drug trafficking, to really benefit communities on both sides of the border.
Do you feel like, and there's been testimony, this isn't just, in some high-profile cases, including in the El Chapo case, there's been testimony from witnesses who were once members of the cartels that there is pretty widespread corruption at high levels of the Mexican government that are preventing them from actually doing what they should do to crack down on the cartels. Do you share those concerns?
I would not necessarily align myself with the testimony of potentially a criminal witness from a case like that. I understand there are concerns about corruption within Mexico, and I understand there's questions about needing to address that. Having said that, I think general accusations about corruption of the entire government, those are not necessarily productive for good U.S.-Mexico engagement.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at is that there are people, and I get the complexities of some testimony, but it's not just a one-off example. And I think the concern I have is that there's just very little being spent, quite honestly, on law enforcement writ large in Mexico. And I just don't know that this has been given the attention it over the last at least 4 years that it should. And hopefully that dynamic is changing. I do think the cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico is really important on this. There's no doubt about that. But I want to, I guess, sort of turn my attention, Sheriff, to you, because with my limited time, you do have sort of one arm tied behind your back, given, I guess, the laws in the state of California, the sanctuary status, which isn't, I don't pretend to understand it at all. It's a mess. But when I was AG in Missouri, we had some pretty unique partnerships where we would deputize some people in our office to work in the U.S. Attorney's office to go after some violent crime that maybe at a local level they were choosing not to pursue. Is that kind of where if you're sort of got your arm tied behind your back, maybe that's a way forward, is you actually have to have more federal agents working with the U.S. attorneys to go after these folks, because at a local level that's harder to do?
So there's two parts to that question. Under California law, I'm prohibited from cooperating with ICE in any manner, including housing of individuals within my jails. I cannot hold ICE detainees in my jails. Regarding federal task force or designating task force officers or those who are attorneys to prosecute on behalf of the U.S. Attorney's Office, that is being done in California, but not specific to immigration, specific to the issues of fentanyl directly.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And again, to the witnesses, thank you for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we move on, I'd like to enter into the record a letter of support from CADCA, the Premier Prevention Association, representing over 7,000 coalition members across the country in strong support of the Halt Fentanyl. CADCA coalitions support millions of high school and middle school students across this nation and have proven effective in reducing youth substance abuse and use. We thank them for their support of Halt Fentanyl. Senator Hirono.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you for coming and testifying, and of course my sympathies to Mr. Perita and Ms. Noring. Obviously, this is a complicated question in the sense that we have disagreements on who is bringing in fentanyl into our country, but we all know that it is creating basically a havoc. And I particularly was interested in noting how we can prevent young people from getting access to fentanyl at the same time, and their analogs. At the same time, we need a Justice Department that is stable. Right now, there is chaos as this administration tries to eliminate anybody who can stand up to them. And in addition, when they want the names of everyone who had anything to do with the January 6th investigations and prosecutions, we are talking about potentially thousands of FBI agents. So you can imagine the chaos that is going on in that department. For Mr. Puerto, I know you mentioned the Dead on Arrival as a documentary that is shown. I mean, what age do you think that the children should be when they are alerted to, for example, not buying anything on the internet? And this goes for Ms. Nodding too, in terms of prevention. What is an age? And then, does a documentary like the one you mentioned, does it really impact the young people? If not, what does in terms of education?
Dead on Arrival, again, is a 22-minute documentary that we use in junior high schools and high schools across the nation. We just started also with 5th and 6th graders as well. We started that in Lake County, California, where Mr. Filson, who's behind me here, went up there and saw more than 5,000 students. Ms. Hirono, I have a stack of letters from high school students, junior high school students, elementary school students who have seen this documentary that had absolutely no idea of the impending danger and had no idea that buying illicit fentanyl was as easy as ordering a pizza through Snapchat. That's how easy it is.
And the danger of this drug is they can die on first use.
According to the New England Journal of Medicine, 22 children per week died in the year 2022 between the ages